Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm once again joined by Michael Bonner, who has been on here a couple times already. And the first time we discussed this, I believe this is your most recent book, How the Past Can Renew the Present. And the last time he was on, which was already a year ago, and man, fly by fast. And we discussed how tyrants use history to preserve it in their image. And this time, we're going to talk about fairly similar, but we're going to discuss empires and what empires actually are about and how there are. I'm going to argue that, and I think this kind of obvious, that there are really no good empires out there. And let's face it, I mean, most empires, and we're going to discuss this, of course, later in this episode as well, that are mostly about extortion and, about power and influence. But what are your perception of empires? You and I were both fascinated by this. So, what are your perception of empires in your view?
Very good question, and thanks for having me back. By the way, I don't know how the weather is where you are, but where
Oh,
I'm,
fantastic!
it's fantastic. Well, it's the
Yeah.
exact opposite here, so I'm much rather be talking to you than standing outside in the cold.
That's
Uh,
fair.
so yeah, I mean, I take your point about no good empires, and I think that there's a kind of false nostalgia, if that's even the right word,
Yeah.
where certain people will look back on an imperial moment or on an imperial heritage or something, and think that there were either, it wasn't all bad or there were aspects that were good,
Yeah.
and so amidst all sorts of other, more obviously horrible crimes and so forth. However, not all empires are the same. There, and of course, what is meant by empire is, kind of different depending on who you talk to. There are people. I think that there was a time, for instance, um, maybe not within living memory, but just outside living memory, when the United States of America was indeed an empire with overseas holdings
I
and
mean,
so forth.
in a sense, by the sheer size, they kind of still are. I mean, if you look at
Well, yeah, I
the
was exactly.
population and diversity of the United States, you just say it's a falling empire, but it's in a sense it is still kind of an empire if you look at it that way.
You can look at it that way, and yeah, that was what I was going to say. That there are people who will say, well, they no longer hold the Philippines or
Yeah,
whatever. But then there are others who view all, as you say, first of all, the sheer size of such a continental country, um, and its international hegemony, cultural. I hate that word hegemony. It feels like I'm
mm,
feels like I'm talking like one of those people obsessed with Foucault or something. But
yeah,
people still use the word hegemony a lot, because of an international culture and globalization and military reach. People will say, well, that's the American empire. And then you also have the question of, say, France's uh, economic and military relationships with the former
yeah,
former French Africa and so forth. But then there are other questions. Is Canada
yeah.
an empire? Um,
I mean, wouldn't you say because it's technically still under king, right? So technically, I mean, it's an independent country, but technically, because they're still under the king of England, there's still technically sovereignty of Britain. In a way, I would say. So kind of they're still halfway through. I would say they are a colony, but I don't know. Well, obviously they're not in officially a colony, but you know what I mean.
well, I mean, there is still a. I mean, it's debatable what it means to preserve the North American ancien regime as we do, right?
Yeah,
In Canada, and sharing a personal, the sovereign of Canada, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. It's the same man right now, but it isn't the same legal entity. So, that's something that's arguably new in human history. I don't know if there's an older parallel for that kind of relationship, but it doesn't amount to any kind of political union, or much less control. And this is actually a very interesting point. Even I guess technically, even for a few days when and it was only a few days when I was born. Technically, the Canadian Constitution uh, resided in London, and the reason for that is that it was um, not it wasn't possible for us to amend it by ourselves without going through London, and that was not because the British wanted that. They didn't want that. They opposed that from the beginning, but acquiesced to it because Quebec and Ontario didn't trust one another to uh to have full control over amendments and so forth, at the time of Confederation. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting as to what you would call that. It's obviously a residue of empire.
yeah,
Um, and I don't know. I have to. I'm comfortable with that. I don't mind. I don't mind that sort of association continuing. I like having um, a uh, a monarch, even a non-resident one. But it's certainly a peculiar, unusual uh, political or constitutional arrangement. And it's a very different vision, obviously, from, in the New World. It's a very different vision from the kind of American vision of Republican sovereignty. But I would say it's been quite successful.
mm. I want to begin, and before we go into that, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of empire apologies, such as, in some ways, surprisingly, some historians are Andrew Roberts is one, for example, and it's quite surprising how actually historians kind of tend to fall into this category. But what do you think it's about romanticism of the empire of the lost, and to use one example, the lost of the British Empire, for example, if you read books like Pierce Brand, I don't think it. I think it's Pierce Brandon's Decline and Fall of the British Empire and other such work, and I don't remember the Pierce, and I don't remember his name, but it's a book even on the rebellions of the British Empire, and you realize that they weren't the good guys at all. But what, and when you read the text, it's right there in front of you. And especially some historians, like I
Mm.
mentioned, Andrew Roberts, for example, what do you think it is about the idea of romanticism and again, I'm only going to use the British Empire as for example of this. What do you think it is about the romanticism of empire?
Well, uh, I think that, I mean, it's not always, there is indeed romanticism of empire. There is also just sort of, there are some people, I think, who look back on these things in good faith, and they feel that on balance they approve. And it isn't just the sort of modern empires. I mean, there are people who get really excited about, the Mongols,
Yeah,
or about the Abbasid um, state. obviously the under the late Shah of Iran, the heritage of the Achaemenid state was, really a big deal, and the veneration of Cyrus the Great and so forth. Um,
I mean, don't get me wrong. There are exciting aspects about reading about these empires, and I find it fascinating too. But we should also realize that there's, like we said, there is an agenda behind why you want an empire in the first place.
right. So in the to focus on the nostalgia element,
Yeah.
I think that the nostalgia is caused not necessarily because of a genuine memory of empire, because I think, especially in the case of the British, most Britons probably didn't even know that they had one.
Hmm.
Um, and your typical, like the idea that a coal miner in Wales, or my ancestors up in Northumbria and Yorkshire, that they were all excited about overseas empire. I just don't
Yeah.
think that that was ever really true. However, I think that there is a a memory, which may not be a real memory, but a sense, perhaps, that an imperial project of one form or another was a cause for national unity. Now, I don't think that that was ever really true, but I think that at a time when um, holding uh, holding nation states together, such as we now have, the great difficulty in doing so, people will reach for various different things and feel that there was some kind of great national purpose that once existed that was then lost. Now, having said that, not everybody thought that. In fact, I believe that very few people actually believed that, but some genuinely did. And I don't think that they were always right. Um, there's that famous French phrase of the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission of the French
Yeah.
Empire. And of course, it's somewhat debatable to what extent that, well, more than somewhat, it's highly questionable to what extent that that
You
was.
let me on nicely there because I want to talk about that as well. One of the reasons why one of the arguments for why they colonize these people is that they are colonized, are civilized according to Western view and what Western civilization call civilization. I mean, take a look at India, for example. They had a writing system a dozen years, centuries before Europe had. So it's
Yeah,
ludicrous when you actually read history of, say, India, for example, or other civilization that to say, oh no, these are civilized savage people. I mean, for example, in Africa, they can look at the Great Zimbabwe as an example of this, that these were civilized cultures, or Egypt, for example, which had way before Europe even was a thing. So it's ludicrous to think that, you know, the argument for why they need to rule over these people is civilize them. But we know that for a fact that were
yeah.
they were way more civilized than what the British propaganda made it believe.
Yes, and I think it's important to ask why those ideas were believed by those who held them. Again, I think it was very few people on the whole who actually took an interest in this, but um, surely one of the reasons is that it's a byproduct, like the idea that there was some kind of civilizing process associated with modernity,
Yeah,
uh, that's a byproduct of processes that Europeans first inflicted upon themselves, right?
yeah.
Um, the idea that you
There's
had to,
kind of a racist agenda
Oh, right.
behind this.
But then then it became, yes, when it gets then blended with this idea that there's a uh that it must be spread to the whole world and
Yeah,
that there are backwards inferior peoples who need to be educated and corrected and so forth, you would easily find um justification for it in a racialist theory, which were floating around the 19th century. And um, there's a kind of chicken and egg question. Did people feel that they needed to spread, quote unquote, civilization because they were racist, or did they reach for some kind of racialist
yeah,
doctrine because they wished to find a justification uh, to do this? And you know, um, I think that that's a two-edged sword in and of itself, leaving aside the racism.
yeah,
The theory of a civilizing mission or a kind of uh, mission to enlighten others, however that may be defined. I mean that's a very old idea, but people will immediately associate it with something, with the Enlightenment, with 18th century ideas that take shape at home and then get sort of broadcast um, elsewhere. And as we know, it miscarried dreadfully. But of course, there were empires in which I can think of one, the Belgian Empire, which did not even, as far as I know, had no such pretense whatsoever. They didn't even claim to be improving anybody or and I think it's a very deep and embarrassing moral question to wonder is actually whether that's better or worse.
yeah. And another thing, of course, when it comes to at least the Asian colonies, is of course that trade was a main factor here of how, especially in India, how the East India Company eventually came to rule over the Indian nation. But
Yeah.
what's interesting is that the Europeans didn't have anything that says Chinese or Indians or other civilizations wanted from them. It was actually the other way
Mhm.
around, that they had all the luxury goods that the Europeans wanted to, such as spices or silk or other luxury goods that the Europeans wanted from the Asians. But while they may have been technologically superior, I mean, I wouldn't even say superior because we know early cannons and muskets were quite unreliable, as we will see, as we now will see when we talk about Spanish later on. But
Yeah.
it's even though they were somewhat, I'm not saying this in quotes superior of weaponry technology. They didn't really want the technology because they were quite happy with what they had, and they like I said, the Europeans wanted what the Asians had, but the Asians were not interested in it because the Europe that didn't really have anything to offer the
Right.
Asians.
And there's that famous, you're probably thinking of that famous exchange between the British trade representative and the Qianlong
Yeah,
emperor, right? He said basically like what you have we don't want, and what we have you couldn't possibly understand.
yeah.
So and it wouldn't work. He says it wouldn't work in your faraway island. But
That's probably one reason why they say that, for example, Chinese never actually colonized Europe, and it didn't become the other way around because there were no interest. And it would be interesting to see if it was the other way around, that the China, for example, colonized Europe and not the Europeans who colonized Asia, for example. But I believe one of the
well,
reasons is that they didn't have any trade interest in trade or any goods that the Chinese or Indians, for example, wanted from Europe. Then, and like we
well,
said,
that's true. Yes, that's true. But it could have happened.
Yeah,
First of all, uh, the Umayyad conquests could have gone further and could have lasted longer. First of all,
yeah.
that could
I
that
mean, in my view, the Battle of I'm sure you referred to Battle of Tours, but it's you talked about this before, and it's kind of over exaggerated at the time. I don't think, to be honest, I don't think it would have done much further, maybe a little bit further into France, but I
well
don't
they
think I think it was probably more the skirmish for the Umayyad troops into Europe at the time. So I think it's probably an over exaggerated battle at the time because it just made a European triumph. But for the Umayyads, I don't think it was that big of a deal. The
no
loss of the
it
Tours.
wasn't, but they could have penetrated further and held more territory.
That's
There's
probably true. Yeah,
and so could have the Mongols. The Mongols, um, went, uh, the famous destruction of Kiev and so forth. Um, and they ruled over Muscovy for a long time. They might have gone further, but then the question be, well, would that be colonialism? I mean,
yeah,
is it right to describe those sort of large land empires
yeah,
as colonial? Like, was Iran a colony of the Arabs?
yeah.
It's probably not quite the right word, but even if
It's a
even
different
if
thing. Yeah,
you allow that, it's still, like these conquests, as you allude, they were quite impressive in one direction and less impressive in another, most likely because Europe didn't have anything that anybody wanted.
mm,
But then again, uh, think about a group like the Vikings.
yeah.
I, th I think we're both descended from Vikings, but they went all over the world, and technically they did establish literal colonies because they were living
Yeah.
there, right? And then they would get absorbed.
I mean, England was the Danelaw was in a sense of very much a colony, if to use the modern term. I mean, they did probably didn't look at it that way because it wasn't a term yet. But yeah, the Danelaw was very much a
And so was
colony.
Sicily.
Yeah,
Sicily, areas along the Volga and Kiev itself, these little sort of
one
outposts.
could argue by that argument that the Angeva regime under Henry II was in a way a colony because it was kind of overseas with the holdings in France and Normandy. One could say that it was sort of a colonial empire in a way.
Right. Okay. Here's another example because it's more in the same time area that we're thinking of the European empires. The Ottoman Empire.
Mm,
Is that a colonial empire? I mean, would you have said that Egypt was a colony, or that Baghdad or Mecca was a colony of
yeah.
the Turks? I mean, it's an interesting question to ask that, and it's also pertinent today when people talk about Russian uh, aggression, and they talk about the war on Ukraine as a colonial war. Now, I agree that it's fundamentally evil, but I don't know if colonial is the
Yeah.
right word for that. Um,
Actually,
and
may I put you on hold because I want to come back to 21st imperialism in by the end of the episode. So we're going to come back to Russia in by the end of
of
this
course, I
episode
don't,
because I
I
want
don't
to.
want to.
Yeah,
I don't,
no, I
I
mean
don't,
we will come back there, but I just want to put it on hold a little bit. But I want to go back to the Mongols, and I think there's a point to this because early recent historians on the Mongol Empire has argued, and I kind of tend to agree with them that one of the reasons that the Mongols stopped at say Kiev and by Baghdad and didn't go any further in. Of course, there was some defeats in the play as well. But what some historians argue is that the again you have the when it comes to the Mongols, you have the gigantic Eurasian steppes, and we talked about this in our last
Yeah.
episode of Tamerlane, where it's that's one of the reasons it was so easy to conquer this city because it was so easy to get. You didn't have mountain passes in the way that you had to get through. Well, you
Yeah.
had it in India, but in other when it comes to the steppes, it was a flat land, so it was easy to do a kind of a blitzkrieg conquest, to use a modern term, as some historians do when it comes to the Mongol conquest. But when you get into Europe and other places, you have a different kind of landscape, and the horses that the Mongols use are used to Eurasian steppes, and they're accustomed to that, and they're not really accustomed to the European landscape, which is much more mountainous and much more not as flat as the Eurasian steppe because it ends with kind of Ukraine and Hungary. That's
Yeah.
why it's so easy to conquer. But so we had to take a look at the geopolitical landscape as well, why the Mongols stopped at that point, and should they probably have come past Ukraine or say gone to Cairo? Probably, if they tried, but we also have to take a look at like I said, the geopolitical landscape of things
Yeah,
as well.
agreed. I mean, they could have, if they had really wanted or needed to, they could have gone as far as the Huns did, right? Um, and they could have established a base of power in the Pannonian plain in Hungary. But history is full of these chances, and of course, one of the worst things that an historian can do is to fail to take into account not only the geopolitical circumstances of the day, but also geography,
Yeah,
right? And one of the main things that made uh uh as you say, that made Europe expand westward and not Asia, either westward or eastward, uh, is geography.
yeah,
And the Vikings are arguably the first to start doing that, right?
yeah,
So and I think Peter Frankopan in his Silk Roads, he talks about the what struck him as a when he was a boy, what struck him as a conundrum. Why did Alexander the Great go east and not west?
yeah. There was nothing to do at the
Yeah,
time
exactly,
in the West.
exactly.
I mean,
And
Rome was just about to start its city growth at the time of Alexander, so he probably didn't even know that Rome existed because it was just a little, pardon my French, just a little shit on the map at the time. But yeah, there was not an civilization in Europe was just tribes basically at the time of Alexander.
yeah. Now, to go back to another thing though, this question of technology, right? Um, in the 19th century,
Yeah,
and I think a lot of people, even to this moment, they view apparent Western superiority, if they still even use that word, or a kind of heightened, uh, advanced civilization, so forth. They What they're really thinking of is technology.
yeah,
And as I say in my previous book, that's completely the wrong way to think about it. In fact, technology is more likely than not to undermine the spiritual and intellectual uh, uh, wherewithal that makes settled and civilized life possible. And the conflicts of the 20th century in Europe um, prove also about how much worse technology will make social decomposition and warfare. So I don't I don't have an answer now as to what I don't know what most people make of that, although there is
Yeah.
that so-called the tech optimist manifesto, which seems to place, I think, an unreasonable amount of faith in the promise of technology. But I think it's very hard now for us to, or for anyone to think this way. I
Yeah.
mean, I could not imagine a political leader now saying, well, we're top of the heap because we have all this technology. I
I
mean,
don't think of one leader who could say that. I certainly can't think of one
he would
leader.
say it, but it
Yeah.
would sound ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, everything that he says is ridiculous. So to be fair,
Okay.
but
Well,
but uh,
yeah.
but let's go back to the idea of technology and genuine transmission. Let me a nice little bit there because the Spanish is a clear example of this. That technological superiority isn't always necessarily guaranteed
Yeah.
victory because we see this in especially when it came to the Aztecs conquest and Noche Triste, it was almost a disaster for Cortes when they came to conquer the
Yeah.
Aztecs. So
Yeah.
it's like we see, and as I said earlier, the muskets of the time weren't necessarily reliable and could be more dangerous than actually useful. So it's not necessarily as we thought, but always that the technology were guaranteed victory at the time.
Yeah. And that's because it wasn't at all a fair fight, right?
Mm.
But you go back further, uh, Rome, uh, Rome had something much more like a fair fight with, say, Germanic barbarians, uh, if that's the right word, and they couldn't. No, neither side could really claim, at least in a military sense, neither side could claim a kind of technological superiority over the other. But Rome still claimed the its own superiority because of uh, written law. They always came back to that.
Yeah,
Um, and similarly, there's an older Iranian discourse about settled, a kind of settled sedentary order versus the chaos of the nomadic world. And of course, it's kind of questionable how chaotic it really was. But in any case, those are, I think, equivalent declarations of perceived uh, superiority, which um, don't really have anything to do with what we would call technology. I think it was Karl Popper who talked about social technology or something like that. It might be something that you could call social technology, but I mean, the in the end, the nomadic world, the world outside,
mm,
uh, either nomadic or barbarian, depending on your perspective, outside those two great empires, they prevailed in the end. So who,
I mean, nomads defeated the Romans in the end. So it's not always about, like we said, military superiority or military technology. Sorry.
right. So who in the end had a superior social technology? I
Yeah,
mean, I think that's an important, I think that's an important question. But now, I mean, because technology has spread, it's we won't see those horrific, horrifically uneven contests such as you allude to with the Aztecs or whatever. That's uh, far from what you might see, far from what you would see in the world nowadays, and it would just make no sense to claim that that any particular part of the world is superior to another simply
yeah.
because of better firepower.
Yeah. So then the next topic I want to talk about is how you define, and probably should have started this earlier, but I want to talk a little bit about what defines empire, because like we talked about the Romans, for example, they just sent troops somewhere in the occupied territory after they fought the war. And it had troops stationed there, and that's kind of defined. And we look at maps today, but that wasn't necessarily definition because it didn't obviously have as good maps as much
Mm,
then as today. So by they would define borders by rivers or you know mountain passes, etc. Or they would have troops, like I said, in the occupied provinces that would signify that you are now in Roman territory.
yeah.
But it's not. But the another example of another Roman Empire is the Holy Roman Empire, which is didn't have this. So let's do a comparison and see a little bit about what and then probably Shani read more about the Holy Roman, especially later on. But it's clearly didn't have a military station in, and of course they sent taxation into the emperor in Rome as well as a sign of that you were under Roman control. So let's talk a little bit about what would define, especially when it do a comparison as well to the Holy Roman Empire as well, which is really complicated because it's not an empire in its traditional sense as you think about empires. So let's talk a little bit what you would
Mm,
define as an empire. I mean, I kind of already touched on this a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit more in detail on this
mm.
topic.
I don't know if I could give you an abstract definition, um, but the you know I th- the Roman Empire is a very interesting example because it rose so slowly,
Yeah.
in comparison with, say, uh, the Mongols, or
Mm.
uh, classic example would be the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. Um, the British Empire also arose quite slowly, but the Roman one was probably the slowest of them all. And it arguably starts off with a series of conquests, yes, but defensive alliances that you have these cities that get sort of absorbed but made into allies, and then this sort of very slow moving process of welding the Italian peninsula into a military alliance, like a not just an alliance, but like a unit. And
And you said paying tribute to, say, Rome, city of Rome, for example, was one way of saying that you're under our superior control.
right, and then eventual expansion of the idea of citizenship and
Yeah,
various demographic changes, and I would argue an almost complete. I mean, it obviously lasted a very long time, but it was sort of very difficult to establish what would be considered a um, what would you say? It's like a sort of stable mode of government,
mm,
stable constitution. Um, Roman law was very impressive, but the succession of the emperors was always a struggle.
yeah.
Uh, so, but then again, the question would be, well, what does that have in common with, say, the Portuguese
Yeah.
Empire, uh, you know, the Soviet Union, or what have you? So yeah, I think I'm always going to trip over and struggle with an abstract definition, but it seems to me quite common nowadays to assert, that there's very much a lot of emphasis on a kind of imperial center, a
Yeah.
metropolis that that extracts wealth from elsewhere. I'm not fully convinced that that's always the case, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't often the case, or very frequently, very frequently the case in many other places. It also involves, certainly in the modern context, or at least recent context, um, trading systems, systems of
Yeah.
trade and defense, like the British uh, customs customs unions, imperial preference, and that sort of thing. Um, I don't know how the French or the Portuguese or the Spanish did it, but
Yes.
basically you have your ships going around patrolling the ocean, protecting the sea lanes so that you can get you can get all the wealth and commodities you need out of your overseas holdings.
Yeah.
You know, that's
Um,
one way of looking.
especially when it comes to medieval, and I think this is colonial powers as well, especially when it comes to again the Spanish, were especially heavy that, but it from the taxation was one thing that I would say you define empires, especially when, like you said, when it comes to medieval empire, that when where the nobility paid the taxations to that, say, did you pay to the Holy Roman Emperor? Did you pay to, for example, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or Kiev or any other, say, empires? So I think taxations as well. And to be fair, I don't think, so yeah, so the taxation is one example, I think, of defining an empire. Where who did you say your taxes to?
Yeah, I guess so, but and I think in very many cases that would certainly be true. But if you were living in uh Upper Canada in the 19th century, before after Confederation, where would you were definitely part of an empire, but
Yeah.
your taxes were not being carried off to London.
I mean, to be fair, some British colonies did have self-representation that they had, going to, they didn't necessarily pay taxes in London, like you say, they wanted to do with the United States, which again led to the revolution of American Revolution. Sorry, I lost had this, but yeah, like yeah, so British Empire kind of were unique in the sense that they had the colonies were self-representative in a way. I don't know if that's the right word, but I think that the British colonies,
Some were, some were not. Um, there were parliaments, there were parliaments in British North America and legislatures. I forget what they called them in the 13 colonies, but they had been there for a long time.
yeah,
Um, but were they really uh, uh, representative? Was it really representative government, or as we say in Canada, or as was said in Canada, responsible government? Very many people would have said no, and that evolved sort of gradually. Um, but you could also say that certainly by the time the late 19th century came around, that an imperial subject was someone who went off to war to defend the empire.
yeah,
Canada, one of Canada's first great international adventures was the Boer War, the South African War. I forget the dates, the late 19th century, and then came the two
not
great wars.
1890s. I think the Boer War were. I think it was the 1890s.
Yeah, so I mean the idea that Canadians would have gone off to fight in South Africa under some other set of circumstances would have been absurd. But
Yeah,
it was because of the imperial um whatever the word is, imperial union or uh connection
yeah.
that made that you know uh a priority for people. And it wasn't just because, I can't even remember how this went, but there were people, um, rich rich people in Canada who formed their own regiments, not because they were asked to do so, but because they wanted to. They formed regiments and then went off to South Africa to fight, and that was how they
Yeah.
that was how they showed loyalty, and they were not, as I say, they were not compelled to do so.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of an unusual thing. Uh, on the question of tribute, it's another odd thing. I mean, the I think it said that the sort of grain, donations of grain or rice to North Korea from the United States and probably from elsewhere too. I don't know if this is true, but I've heard it that they're received and then labeled as tribute paid to the Kim dynasty,
Yeah.
and in order to create a myth of kind of subordinate status. Something like that also happened between Rome and Persia, and that Persia was very adept at extracting gold as tribute out of the Roman economy, which is very interesting because gold didn't circulate as currency in the Sasanian Empire, so they must have been doing
Yeah.
something else with it, probably sending it to India to offset a trade imbalance. But that's another question. But the for domestic propaganda purposes, the Romans said, well, we're just paying these people to leave us alone because we're superior.
Yeah.
And for the domestic Iranian audience, it was, look, the Romans are paying us tribute. So,
Yeah.
this stuff goes both ways.
Mm. And another thing I want to talk about as well is nationalism and nationalist pride of
Mm,
having an empire. And I read, I think it was last year or 2 years ago that I read The Windrush, which is an amazing book about Jamaican immigrants into Britain. I would highly recommend reading that book. But of course, the Romans, as we have spoken about, for example, or other medieval empires, didn't have nationalism. That would occur in I think it was late 18th century and then grow into
yes.
the 19th century. And I actually made an episode many years ago about the history of nationalism, which I would highly recommend checking out. But what was surprising to me when I read Windrush was that actually, to use one example, Jamaicans, they felt proud to be a part of the British Empire, and they were kind of felt a nationalistic pride in being a
Yes.
part of the British Empire. And when they fought, a lot of them fought as pilots or on the ground in the Second World War, and I think probably the First World War as well. I don't can't say
Mhm.
how many fought in the First World, but Windrush take place in the beginning of the Second World War and until the late 80s. But it's what is interesting is that a lot of these, and I can't speak on behalf of the other colonies, but mainly Jamaica, for example, they were surprisingly proud to be part of the British Empire.
Yes, as were Canadians, and in fact, um, um, the spirit of Canadian patriotism, such as it was for most of the existence of the country, was about flying the flag for the empire,
Yeah,
and that the British uh, connection, if that's the right word, the British heritage and the loyalty to it and so forth, that was the principal form of resistance to
yeah,
continentalism and to the Americans. And people are not necessarily now cheering. They're not cheering on the British Empire now, but in the face of real or apparent threats to our sovereignty, such as have or at least to our economic uh, uh, well-being, Canadian patriotism is once again reaching back for those symbols and
yeah.
all the rest because it's still quite deeply ingrained. So I'm not surprised about that. But again, nationalism is a very curious thing. Um, I think cheering on the empire is a little bit different from nationalism, especially if you think of something like French or German nationalism, and of course British nationalism um, is a very peculiar beast because Britain is not one nation.
Yeah.
In the literal, I'm sure I have some British friends who will be sort of cringing if they hear that, but there are many sort of smaller nations within um, Great Britain,
Yeah.
and there are at least three nations on a large scale within Canada. Uh, and of course, the Aboriginal um, uh, population breaks down into all sorts of other little nations. Um, but that's not what we mean when we're thinking about 19th century nationalism. I see that as um, a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. You have this sort of massive deracinated people who have left the countryside and the family farm. They're pouring into cities. They're all sort of um, they don't know one another. They're strangers. They're all forced to work together. Obviously, I'm generalizing and exaggerating slightly, but they're no longer rooted to the places that they came from. Instead, some new idea of sort of a common uh, identity has to be found to unite them all together.
Mm.
And that starts to take place in arguably earliest in France with the revolution and the sort of um, formation of a French nation, and then it gets really quite accelerated because of both there and everywhere else um, because of industry. And um, I think that there's a certain amount of um, nonsense, shall we say, that goes into that. I mean, who or what is the French nation, first of all? Second, like it's not so much a question of um, what its boundaries are, although that is an important question, but also what is inside the boundary.
Yeah.
Who is a French person? Is it somebody who speaks French? Well, um, there are lots of those
Mm.
outside the borders, and that became something like an emergency and cause for warfare in the context of Germany. There are also,
Yeah.
there are German speakers from Austria to the Volga. Are they part of the German nation? Well, some people thought so, and the result was pretty bad. Um, you know, uh, but I'm not criticizing it simply because it is because of that example. It's also bad because it's in some ways, I think in some very serious ways, it militates against the smaller, more local identities that people were more accustomed to in previous times and in which we evolved as we did. Um, the idea that you belong to this vast community, even the
Yeah.
idea that it's a community, like it's just not like you can't have 80 million people and call it a community. That's
Yeah.
preposterous. At that point, you start getting into this sort of mystical nonsense that you find in the 19th century with the people like Simon Bolivar in
Yeah.
the
I was going to that. Yeah.
yeah, it's just preposterous. Like it's silly. It sounds ridiculous. So, there are people nowadays, I think, who make, in many ways, they make a convincing point. They say, well, the theory that there is no particular meaning to belonging to a
Mm.
nation, that it's just some kind of like imaginary economic unit, if it is even a unit that does nothing but trouble. I don't particularly like that. I mean, we've inherited this. Like we should try to,
Yeah.
or these arrangements, we should try to make the best of it. countries like America and Canada are not really one nation, even when they
Yeah.
all speak, even the English speaking parts of America, you can break them down further into different things. But anyway, the point is that there are extremes of both. The two extremes, either that the nation has a kind of spiritual, uh, metaphysical existence in and of itself. That's one extreme, and the other extreme is that it doesn't exist at all and shouldn't be
Yeah.
considered of any importance whatsoever. Those are both wrong. But when you blend this kind of nationalism in with an imperial, the theory of an imperial destiny, I think that you, or not a destiny isn't the right word, but when you blend nationalism and imperialism, I think that you get the worst of
Mm.
all possible results, and arguably something like the Holy Roman Empire that you alluded to, as silly as that was, uh,
Just
it
glad that phase is over.
but number one, first of all, it lasted.
Yeah.
Second, even when it seemed like it was completely blown apart so many times in the past, and that
That's fair. Yeah.
it didn't it was an idea that had, quite a bit of inertia to it. And it was capable. I mean, whether it's kind of weird to think about the Holy Roman Empire having real like authority, but insofar as it did have authority, it was perfectly capable of coexisting amongst and above many different nations and all sorts of different peoples. And the theory that it was a Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which was sometimes asserted, that whole sort of title, that wasn't really true. Um, and it wouldn't have been good if it was. Um, so that they called it an empire because it um
It was
uh,
neither holy nor Roman.
nor an empire, yeah, but they call it that, they call it empire first of all because it harks back to a Roman,
Yeah. The idea that you were crowned by the Pope as the righteous ruler.
right, as a continuation of the late antique
Yeah.
empire of Constantine
It's
company.
kind of ironic that in a way that the Germans ended up calling wanting to be Romans when they fought the Romans for the entire span of the Roman Empire. It might be me, but I just find it a bit ironic.
It is and it isn't because Charlemagne and company, and then afterward the what do they call them? The Ottonian,
Yeah, the Otonian, yeah,
yeah, the Ottonians. They they're not actually looking back to Augustus and Constantine.
yeah,
Even when they sometimes say they are, they're not. What they're thinking of is more like Theodoric, and the
yeah,
Visigothic rulers of Spain, that there's a kind of Germanic overclass that is trying to habituate itself, or assimilate itself to a fundamentally Roman way of doing things in late antiquity, and they're very big on Latin and Christianity and what have you. Very keen on getting the Eastern court to respect them, um, normally unsuccessfully.
I mean, to be fair, they didn't respect the Eastern court either that much. So
Unfortunately, not. But it's the exact what they're doing is the exact opposite of, say, the
yeah,
caliphs. The caliphs did not, except insofar as there was a kind of Iranianizing uh, element to Abbasid high culture. that they didn't arrive in, say, Egypt or in Iran and then adopt the local language and religion. They had their own language and they had their own religion. Like this is the thesis of what is his name? He wrote Muhammad and Charlemagne. Uh,
And the note.
Henri Pirenne.
Yeah.
This is that's the thesis. He basically leaves the, and I still find it persuasive. He lets the barbarians off the hook um for bringing down the Roman Empire and portrays them as, I think, convincingly as fundamentally interested, above all in carrying on the imperial
Yeah.
in the
Yeah,
imperial.
there's a German historian as well, and I have to look up his name too. But there's a historian as well who wrote a biography on Theodoric. Give me just one
Oh,
second.
I know who you mean. I've
Hans Ulrich Weiner and John Noel Dill,
Yeah,
I think they argue the same thing that in theory he was an emperor in all but name, but he respected the Eastern Roman Empire so too much that he actually didn't use the term emperor or imperator in his title. He was just a king. So and I've spoken about this before, like with Brian Ward Perkins when we discussed. I think it was last year now
yeah,
about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire that they didn't look at themselves as, oh, I guess we're Italians now and we make pizza and so and so, but for all they cared, they were still Romans and they were still, even if Theodoric, for example, was still the king, they still looked at themselves as Romans, but they didn't think that, oh, suddenly no, Rome's fallen. And I hate that term. We're in the Dark Ages now. Now it's suddenly in the medieval era, and everything is dark and gritty. It wasn't, but this is just to the point that that they still look at themselves as Roman. Probably a century still after the so-called fall of
yes,
Rome. 476 is just a silly date that some historians made up, in my view, that Rome fell, and it didn't fall in the sense that 1177 BC was the end of
yeah,
the Bronze Age. Suddenly, they in the Iron Age or whatever. It's it's just a simple day to simplify events that they use 476 as the fall of Rome, and there probably wasn't an either God or Justus Romulus. In my view, that's sounds more like a fairy tale than, because it's a bit ironic that too coincidental that the last leader would be named Romulus or Justus by
mm,
coincidence in my view, but about the I know, but still like we talked about, to make a long story short, the Italians didn't Romans, sorry, didn't
yeah,
suddenly look at themselves as Italians and suddenly they're not Romans anymore. For all they care, they were still Romans even under Theodoric's rules.
right. And of course, that opens the door back up to the nationalist question. I mean, would a person living in Tuscany in the early 19th century have thought of himself as an Italian?
Yeah.
Probably not. But um, and that is a development, of nationalism, which liberals originally encouraged and adopted and so forth. But it comes a long, 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 long while after these sorts of um, what would you say? Either calamitous breaks like 476,
Yeah.
depending on your perspective, or this sort of long continuity of a
Mm.
kind of Roman of a Roman high culture that even its invaders wanted to adopt. The parallel for that, by the way, is
And
China.
yeah, to be fair, I think most. and Roman historians on this period agree that 476 probably wasn't like the definite fall of Rome. I mean, I think to the common viewer who hasn't read much on the topic, I think they probably, oh, 476, well, that's when Rome fell, like I said, but no, it's just, like I said, it's probably Gibbon or someone invented that the Western Roman Empire fell that date. It was not like, it's ludicrous to think that that's what actually happened.
Yeah, indeed. And there were so many other worse disasters after that that um, that could qualify by the same logic that could qualify as, the end.
Yeah,
But um, it's not actually that unique. It's, the steppe peoples who ruled China
yeah,
more often than not. It's the same thing. They get sort of absorbed into this Confucian culture, and the rulers of the rulers of medieval Iran. It's the same story. But in the West, I think I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because of 19th century nationalism that we view this so differently, or that the or maybe it's the Reformation, or some, the breakup of Christendom or
mm,
something. It's very hard for us to look back on a kind of uh larger sort of either Roman or Christian sort of supranational,
yeah,
supra-tribal identity, and um see unity there. But um in the case of China, from certainly from their own perspective at least, China has just always been China. But we don't call European civilization Roman,
no,
even though it would arguably be well justified to do so, at least up to a certain point. But the same
mm,
could also be said of a place like Egypt or the Levant. They had been Roman for 800 years by the time of the Arab conquests. But it's fascinating, at least to me anyway, how quickly that seems to change.
yeah,
That the Roman heritage just sort of, I mean, it could be an illusion of the sources, but it seems as though the Roman um, the Roman identity of those parts of the world sort of disappears quickly. But then in Europe, it it sort of floats along for a very, very long time, and then I don't know when, sometime within the last 200 or 300 years, completely it's completely gone. And nationalism is probably what finishes it off. Um, but to go back to the question of more recent empires, I do think that the question of nationalism in, say, the I don't know, the Napoleonic Empire, or the German empires, most notoriously the Third Reich, and then the Soviet Union, and then Russia. It just seems as though you get really the absolute worst the absolute worst flaws of empire, and the worst flaws of nationalism.
yeah, and
Whereas the British Empire is very different, because there's no one single sort of national
yeah.
identity.
I mean, I think Austria-Hungary is actually a good example of this because they had so many nationalities, or Hungarians, the Slav, and Czech, and they had so many nationalities that tried to implement the German language as the lingua franca in their empire, but still they had so many nationalities within their empire, and so I think it was difficult to determine a nationalism in Austria-Hungary, and this might be my opinion, but I think there's something to that.
Yeah. Well, people say, well, some historians say that Austria-Hungary was sort of moribund, or uh, bound to collapse some point, and it's
To be fair, that's the same with you can say that about any empire.
well, exactly. I'm not sure how convincing that idea genuinely is. I mean, it's conceivable that even after the First World War, that the Allies could have rehabilitated it. I mean, that may seem highly unlikely, but it's not totally unheard of or completely impossible.
Yeah.
And it might have been better if they had done that. But that's just kind of wild speculation. But if you think about, you know, what is the European Union now? I
Yeah.
mean, there's no emperor, there's no uh
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people compare the European Union to the Holy Roman Empire in a
exactly.
sense.
That's what I'm getting at. That it's sort of like, well, I mean, you've kind of exchanged one supranational body of uncertain uncertain legitimacy and sort of unclear borders, since it's
Yeah.
possible that it could
I
just
mean,
keep.
to be fair, you have independent countries, but so did the Holy Roman Empire. You did not have a standing army, but neither did the Holy Roman Empire. You had, like you said, you can cross borders in the EU, and you don't really need a passport to say go from Netherlands to Germany or France. You can just hop on a train and go to France, Denmark, or Sweden, or any other Norway or any other country you would like to if you want to take a vacation somewhere, and or you can interrail without any issues.
Yeah.
But you could basically do that in the whole Roman Empire as well. So can see a fair comparison. And you do have a parliament in the EU as well, and I don't know enough about. I don't know if that's a comparison with the whole Roman Empire, but they do have a kind of its own parliament for the EU. So in many ways, I would kind of argue that I
Hmm.
kind of tend to agree that the EU is kind of the second Holy Roman Empire in a way.
Yeah, but it lacks the ideology, right?
Yeah.
It lacks a sense of itself as a Christian.
Mine is, but apart from the ideology, I would say it's very, very similar to, with current times, I think we are about to see a standing army in the EU with what we see happening now in 2025 at the time of this recording. I think it's fair to
Yeah.
say that we could actually get a standing ar European army.
My question about that, and I just don't really know enough, is that I mean, how does that square with NATO? I mean,
Yeah.
would it be separate from NATO? I don't know. And if
And
it,
and then speaking of NATO, sorry to interrupt you, but that in itself kind of is an empire as well, if you look at it that way.
well, maybe. I mean, I think that the Americans don't want, like, if it is if it is to be thought of in those terms, I think the Americans don't want it
Yeah.
uh, like that. I think, I mean, it's hard to tell based on what. Um, I think that the Americans have always wanted or claimed to want more, more like a relationship among equals and partners rather than subordinates.
I'm gonna
But then again,
counter-argue with that with the current president of the United States, but I will get back to that in a second.
well, that could be, but I mean, I just don't, I don't know. I don't know what it is they
Mm.
want right now. But uh, uh, conversely, how powerful do the Americans actually want Europe to be? I
Yeah.
mean, I think that that's a very, that's, I mean, that is
Mm.
a very dangerous question.
And that kind of goes back to America is kind of the New Britain in that way, because Britain didn't want a powerful European country because it threw off the balance. as they argued in the 19th, 20th century. For example, why they didn't want France to be as huge as it was, or Germany to be as united as it was, because
Yeah.
it threw off the balance, European balance. They wanted minor countries because it was easy to, I believe, to control, and that's my opinion. But that's why they were sent to Napoleon, for example, because he actually
Yes.
almost united Europe in a way, and they didn't like the British didn't like that. So in a way you can still see that mentality in the United States today.
But are they really thinking that? Because I mean they could be. I don't know. I mean they in my opinion they ought to be.
Yeah,
Because I mean let me put this to you. Supposing I last I heard Germany is going to be releasing €1 trillion
yeah.
for rearmament or defense. Now,
We all
sure
know
that
why that happened. What that happened the last time. I'm kidding, by the way. I'm kidding.
no, but the last two times.
Yeah,
And I don't wish to vilify Germany unfairly or to impute some kind of ill will. But, uh, but a rearmed Germany, I don't know what €1 trillion will buy. I don't know,
yeah,
but probably quite a lot in comparison with what has now been. It won't stop there. If they're serious, they will keep going.
yeah.
And
I mean, to be fair, though, in defense of Germany, their reasoning is pretty clear when it comes to Russian imperialism.
and they are
And
absolutely
yeah,
right. But do the Americans want that?
yeah,
I mean,
that's the
I don't
thing.
know. I don't have an answer. But historically, the Americans have not wanted that,
Mm,
and they have uh, the the causes of the two wars were not. It wasn't just armament alone. There were other causes, but um, arming Europe to the teeth has like very obvious risks. And I'm not saying this because I think that
yeah,
they shouldn't be armed. I think that they should be. But the Americans are going to get potentially they're going to get far more than they bargained for out of this if the result is full strategic independence
yeah,
from from Washington. And ironically, I mean, questions about demographics and so forth aside, ironically, what what the Trump administration is saying now may end up reviving Europe as a significant
yeah.
uh, power more than anything else anybody has done so far, and that simply carries risks. And to my way of thinking, I've lived in Europe. Um,
So
not
do
not
I.
you still do. Um, and I care about it very much, but um as much as frustrating as I found the European Union and as kind of difficult the sort of bureaucratic culture of France and Germany was, that the EU is now arguably more important and more
Yeah,
relevant than at any other time in certainly
absolutely. Yeah,
in my life, and they cannot screw it up.
yeah. There is actually a book, and I'm going to read it soon, and I'm going to have the author on the podcast, of course, about the British Army from 1918 until 1940, and it's
Mm.
called From Victory to Defeat by Robert Lindman. And the thing is, I think we spoke about this on Twitter, where where we talked about how relevant that time period is, especially when it comes to armament and the army, because we see that Europe has been dependent on the United States and NATO for so long, because the United States has been the backbone of NATO so as up to now, and we haven't really
Yeah.
thought about rearming Europe, and because like I said, we've been relying on the United States pretty much from the Second World War up until now, and that's a big mistake. And we see when we see interviews of British youth and youth in the young kids in general, they don't want to serve, and that's a massive problem. And you
Yeah.
see
I mean,
Russia
that
and
would
doing the
change.
opposite of what we are doing, and it's really interesting to see how relevant the 1930s is when it comes to military and how we should have another Dunkirk and how we should have another 5, 6, 10 years of warfare, if not longer, because we have been so foolish not to rearm our
Yeah.
military because we relied too much on the United States up until now. And when you had the Trump administration, clearly they're going to the more far right and to Russia supporting the Russian side.
Yeah. I mean, I just,
We are pretty much in the same situation as the 30s when it comes to military armaments, and we need to think about this and how. And I think Macron and the new I don't remember the name of the new German chancellor, but I think they got a point, and I think we really need to step up our game and rearm Europe, and like we talked about. So I think definitely that I think they like Macron, not and actually got tremendous respect for him recently with his foreign
yeah.
policy and how much he cares about European safety. And it's clear that we have to do something about this.
Right. Okay. Two things. It isn't just the military element. Um, the reason that Europeans don't have empires anymore, um, if there's one single,
I mean, to be fair, I think that's a good thing.
sure,
And
but
I don't think empires personally belong in the 21st century. That's just me.
right. But I may shock you to say that you would all still have them if it were not for the fact that America polices the oceans
Yeah,
and that we can all trade. And what I find extraordinarily uh, ominous, dangerous, is contemplating or the possibility one that uh, the Americans will just go home and then someone else or some other group of people have to police the oceans. And then international shipping becomes much more expensive and much more dangerous.
yeah,
That will open the door to European countries establishing their own trading systems again, or reestablishing their own trading systems. China will have its own. America will have its own. I mean, I think to be if I had to put money on this, I would say that probably wouldn't happen because I think that Europeans and Americans will, because of geography and because of other, cultural factors, that they're probably always going to be forced together in one way or another. And like the Americans, like the Europeans cannot lose the American market.
yeah,
Americans cannot lose the American market. America cannot let Europe fall under the domination of a single power. Neither can the British. But we still might end up in a world in which there are multiple competing trading systems and effectively naval empires again. And um, that would be a much more dangerous, a much more dangerous world. And if the Americans just don't want to do it anymore, then
yeah,
Europeans are going to have to. And that's just there's just not going to be, if they wish to have trade and they wish to have resources, there's just not going to be any way around it. And that's a frightening thing to
yeah,
contemplate in some ways. So there's that. Second, the rearmament is, I think, uh, highly, I mean, long overdue, first of all. And second, there has to be some kind of cultural a mental, intellectual shift as well. I mean, the world is just not uh, as um, the world is just not as people seem to think it would be back in 1992 or
Yeah.
whatever. And I
It's like
remember it
history comes
well,
to an end, as the famous saying. No, it just started
right.
and it
And you know,
begins now.
the Cold War itself was highly anomalous. And I think that in some kind of strange way, the West benefited from that external pressure from,
Yeah.
and it, there's the people talk about the phenomenon of Cold War liberalism. If there's one particular form of liberalism that I feel kind of most comfortable with, not only because I grew up with it, but also because it just seemed a little bit more rational and measured, it's the Cold War variety when we literally felt, especially in Europe, under siege or under threat from a rival
Mm.
ideology, and when the memory of the Second War was still quite vivid. I mean, it's still, in a sense, it's still vivid to me because my grandparents fought in it.
Yeah.
They're dead now, but I grew up. I think I mentioned this to you in a previous talk. I grew up hearing the stories of the war from people who had been there,
Yeah.
and they were not as old. You know, I guess when I was growing up, they would have been in their 60s. That from my perspective right now, that's I can look forward to being 60, and you know, uh, it just doesn't seem that
Two
remote.
year 2 years from now. I'm kidding.
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
but
I'm
it just
kidding.
not quite that soon,
Yeah.
but it
I
doesn't
get
seem
your point. Yeah.
right. And as you get older, your perspective of these things, like, it just, when I was born in the early 80s, trying to think back to 40 years before that, 40, 45, 50 years before
Yeah.
that, when I was a little boy, that was quite a difficult thing. But
When I
I can
was a boy.
Right, but I can now think 40 years back and remember vividly. So my perspective of these things changes, and I
Yeah.
now realize that a war that was 80 years ago was not that long ago,
Hmm.
and it still has a living effect no matter what. You hear these idiots online talking about Hitler again. I
Yeah.
just don't understand. Trying to rehabilitate, or
Oh.
the way Tucker Carlson seems to be questioning whether or not it was a good idea for the Americans to intervene and defeat Hitler. I mean, obviously, people have asked this question before,
Yeah.
but and I'm not saying that I don't think that historical
Fucking
questions.
Tucker Carlson. Oh, I would like to punch that guy so hard.
No, but it's just like historical questions don't have to be settled
Yeah.
once and for all forever. You can still, it's still worth asking. Was it the right thing to do for Canada, say, to join the second, to declare war a week after Great Britain did? We were in that war from the very beginning. Uh, well, depending on when you think it began, but you know what I mean. You can ask questions like that, and it's worth contemplating. But like the idea that it was somehow like, what would we have done? We would have let Hitler
Hmm.
like have free run of the European continent and to defeat the British Empire, and then
Exterminate all of the Jews.
right, and then go head to head with Stalin and possibly win. Like, would that have been good? I mean, I just can't. I just find that preposterous. But
Yeah.
anyway, that aside, um, oh, where was I going with this? The question of a more powerful, more united, culturally confident Europe is, you know, uh, it's long past
Yeah.
time that this took shape, and uh, it must, like, it just it needs to, it should have happened before, and it needs
Yeah.
to happen. and it needs to
Like I
be
said, we
done.
were too reliant on the United States as the backbone of NATO and backbone of the army because of the sheer numbers, like we said. And that's we realized that now that that was a mistake, and we should absolutely rearm ourselves. And like I said, we are in this kind of 1930s period where we didn't think that war would happen, and we wanted to
Ah,
avoid war at all
that's
costs.
what I wanted to say. I agree. We hear the 1930s thing a lot. Yeah, I can see that. But also, another, I think, good parallel is the 1890s
Yeah,
because you have the cresting wave of globalization, and it's coming down again in the new world. The huge waves of mass immigration were happening, and they were just about to ebb, just as now you have the famous description from John Maynard Keynes of near instantaneous deliveries, and a description of him easily investing his money over the phone and things like that. You can now do that with your smartphone and stuff like that, but you could just do it by telephone in London in the late 19th century. And there was a huge pandemic in the from 1890 to 1895 that kind of drove a lot of people crazy. There was a long COVID of its day too.
that one
But
draw a lot of people crazy too. To be fair.
yes, and it was called the Russian flu. You can look it
Yeah.
up. And this sense of purposelessness. The 1890s was a time of extreme depression and sort of despondency amongst people looking for some kind of purpose, right?
Yeah.
So, many people, and of course, this is coming right after people like Nietzsche are writing about, retrieving this sort of spirit of struggle and all the rest. And, we're not quite there yet, but I think, there are signs of this kind of malaise, and the malaise was broken by war.
Yeah.
Let's be, strong and united and powerful, but hopefully let's not actually have a war.
Mm. I have one last question, and this might be a silly question, but I don't know if you grew up on the show, but I love Star Trek, and I love the Star Trek universe. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because Gene Roddenberry, right? He had a vision when he wrote Star Trek, and I'm sure you know this, that where the Earth was united, that we had one federation of planets and of course I don't think we will have it with aliens anytime soon, but do you think there is some hope that in the near future we will get Gene Roddenberry's vision in a sense would be having maybe not a federation of planets with Vulcans or Klingons or whatever species you might imagine alien species, but where we have a united planet where we have no war, no maybe not hunger, no religion too, if you don't have reference, but do you see, and it's ironic because according to Star Trek lore, you had to get World War III before that actually happened. But do you see that happening at all? That Gene Roddenberry's vision could somehow come true in a way?
What, with planets and aliens?
And not that part, but where we have a united planet, and we have there's not really, maybe not that there's no countries, but maybe it's more like no states in a way, a United States of the world where we have no borders, where we have no, say, religion. I think religion is a bit outstretched. There will always be religion, but let's be fair. I think Christianity or say Islam and Hindus or Hinduism will always be around, but where we have, say, a united planet where we are past the idea of war and imperialism or that kind of that as Gene Roddenberry envisioned
Well,
when he wrote Star Trek. And I think it's a wonderful message, but do you see that as a possibility, even say if we have World War III, do you think that there we realize is that maybe wars are silly thing of the past that we should look for a better future. I mean, I think what the European Union is kind of trying to achieve this in a way, but at least in Europe. But do you think that might happen? And this might be a silly question, but it's. I think there's a wonderful idea behind, maybe a little bit childish idea for for lack of better words. But do you think that could actually happen?
Well, I mean, no. The short answer is no. But this is sort of the question that lurks at the end of Francis Fukuyama's book, right? The End of History and the Last Man. That the part that's called The Last Man is about what a world of sort of victorious liberal democracy would look like. And he didn't predict that it would be just sort of smooth sailing, although everybody
Yeah,
thought he did because they didn't read the book. But his point was that there would still be conflict and struggle and cause for war. And in some ways you can read it to imply that there's actually more cause for it simply because um the theory of liberal democracy is just so boring and frustrating
yeah.
that it might be the final political arrangement, but it contains the which I don't know whether it is or not, but it contains the seeds of its own downfall, and nothing can really be done to um, at least from within liberalism itself, nothing can be done to mitigate that because liberalism works against the pre-liberal social and spiritual foundations of let me start again. It militates against the social foundations that precede liberalism, and it militates against the religious assumptions or the kind of spiritual glue that holds them together. So there's an argument to be made that a world in which um, the world at the end of history, the fantasy world at the end of history, is one of
Yeah.
more conflict than before.
So you think we
And
are closer to say Terminator, where everyone is we have a nuclear war
Germany,
fallout, than say Gene Roddenberry's vision?
uh, closer. I mean, this is sort of
I
like
mean, this is just an example, a silly
yeah, but
example, but
it's like Hobbes, right? That the world is always sort of society is always on the point of disintegrating into the war of all against all, which I guess is kind of like Terminator. Um, but I don't know. I mean,
and I think it's Terminator 3 where we have where it ends with the nuclear war and you see the nuclear warheads go. Not that it necessarily is a good movie, but I think that's where you see the nuclear war go off at the end of the movie.
yeah. Well, look, I'm just trying to put into words what I think here. The utopian vision of a world without conflict, or a world in which conflict is only managed by, I don't know, the United Nations or something like that, that, or the United Federation of Planets, whatever it is, I don't think is very realistic. If you, but it's also just a misunderstanding of our problems. I believe that what went wrong in the 19th and 20th centuries is that because of ideology and because of industry and these huge economic and social dislocations, that we were not, in many places, society broke down completely, almost in like a kind of Hobbesian way, or as it did, say, in Russia in the 1990s or in China in
Yeah,
the collapse of the Qing Empire, or that it was so degraded, the social decomposition was so advanced that it opened the door to, um, Hitlerism uh, and Bolshevism, and that the answer to or the sort of the antidote to those problems is not the liberal vision of severing connections amongst people and trying to establish a kind of world in which nobody has anything to fight for, nobody cares about anything enough. It's more sort of focusing more on local, you know, localism, a lower level of human
yeah,
um, ties and commitments to one another, and maintaining the smaller institutions that make society work, not the vast sort of super structures that overarch everything and that, you know, have almost a kind of mystical uh, justification for them that nobody can really understand. And I think you can see the merits in this way of thinking in America right now. I mean,
yeah.
the social decomposition that came with outsourcing and globalization in the Rust Belt in America, these sort of abandoned, ruined cities that were once very prosperous and so forth. You can see that the answer to the problems there is not not telling people over and over and over again that they should have no um, deeper relationships, or that they should just move to a city, or that they should just abandon their old, you know,
Yeah.
I think you understand what I'm saying here. So yeah, I would set my sights much lower than the United Federation of Planets.
Mm. At least for the near future. And I think we're gonna round it up there. We've been speaking for quite a while. I really hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I have. Before you go, of course, where do people do you have anything you want to promote and new works? And we, of course, in the first time you were here, we discussed, as I said at the start, we discussed the how the past renew the present. Of course, that's your most, I believe, your most recent book. And where can people find that book? And do you have anything new work on the way? What are your social media? If people want to have further questions about this or any other topic, question they might have after our conversations, or any links you wanted to share in the description. Now is a chance to share your social media or any other works you may want to.
Thanks. Yeah, look for me at Dr. Michael Bonner, all one word, on Twitter at Dr. Michael Bonner. You can search for my books on Amazon. The most recent one was called In Defense of Civilization: How Our Past Can Renew Our Present.
Which is a
And
brilliant book, by the way, if I may.
thank you. And my next book, upcoming next year, it's going to be published early next year. The manuscript is due on the 1st of April, on April Fool's Day, a great day to submit a book. It's called The Crisis of Liberalism: The Origin and Destiny of Freedom. It's just a short little treatise on what I think has gone wrong and what might be
That's definitely something we want to
fixed.
cover on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll be the first to know. I'll
Ah,
give you a copy.
fantastic, fantastic. This has been with that as well. We are available on social media under all Instagram, Blue Sky, Twitter, and over that as well. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you can find podcasts these days, on YouTube. We do monthly YouTube live sessions. So if you want to have any historians, if you are interested, we do usually in the midterm months. So if you have any burning questions regarding a topic we might cover in April, we will do our Crusader live streams with Thomas W. Smith, and this should be great fun. So if you have any burning questions regarding the Crusades, now is a chance to ask them and have them answered. So I will check it out. It's on 10th April at 5, 8 p.m., 7:55 or 8 p.m. I don't remember the date in my head. But yeah, check that out. We are also, if you're on Spotify, listen to us on Spotify. Consider giving us 5 stars if you like this episode, or if you hated it, you can give us one. It's at least in my part of the world, it's a free world for now. And if you're on Apple Podcast, you can give us a nice review. That would be lovely. If you're same on Amazon, if you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. Yeah, this has been with that H12. My name's Alan, and I'll see you next time.